know what separates a man who gets trampled from a man who commands the room? It's not the volume of his voice. It's the precision of his silence. Most people think talking more gives them power. They're wrong. They're wrong. I've sat across from men twice my size. Men with guns. Men with armies behind them. And I've watched them crumble. Not because I shouted louder, but because I understood something they didn't. Words are bullets. And most people waste their ammunition on empty threats and desperate explanations, while the real players sit back, calculate, and strike with surgical precision. Here's the truth they won't teach you in any self-help book. Aggressive people are predictable. They operate on emotion, on the need to dominate, to intimidate. But emotion is a weakness. When you're facing someone who's learned to weaponize calm, in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you 6 verbal strategies, not tricks, strategies, that'll shift every confrontation in your favor. These aren't theories. They're tactics I've used in rooms where one wrong word meant the difference between walking out or being carried out. And if you're tired of being pushed around, talked over, or made to feel small, then you'll want to pay attention, because this changes everything. Let me tell you about the first time I truly understood the power of silence. I was sitting in a pub in Birmingham, barely 20 years old, facing a man who thought volume equaled authority. He was shouting, slamming his fist on the table, making threats about what he'd do to me and my family if I didn't comply with his demands. Everyone in that room was watching, waiting to see if young Thomas Shelby would break. And you know what I did? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I sat there, still as stone, let him exhaust himself, let him pour out every ounce of rage he had, until there was nothing left but the echo of his own desperation. Then, when the silence became unbearable for him, when he realized his performance had fallen flat, I leaned forward and spoke one sentence. Just one. And that man, who moments before seemed so powerful, so in control, crumbled like wet paper. That's when I learned the first strategy, and it's the foundation of everything else I'm about to tell you.
Strategy number 1 is what I call the strategic pause. Now listen carefully, because most people get this completely wrong. When someone comes at you with aggression, with raised voices and accusations, your instinct is to defend yourself immediately, to match their energy, to prove them wrong right then and there. That instinct will destroy you every single time, because here's what's really happening in that moment. The aggressive person is operating on pure adrenaline and emotion. Their thinking brain has shut down completely. They're not actually listening to a word you say, they're just waiting for their next opportunity to attack. So when you respond immediately, you're not having a conversation, you're just providing them with more ammunition, more targets, more fuel for their fire. Instead, you pause, not a short pause, not a polite pause, but a deliberate, uncomfortable pause that shifts the entire dynamic of the interaction. You let their words hang in the air.
You let the silence do the heavy lifting. Because silence is a mirror, and when you hold it up to an aggressive person, they're forced to see themselves, to hear how they sound, to feel the weight of their own hostility. And here's the beautiful part. While they're scrambling to fill that silence, while they're becoming increasingly uncomfortable with their own reflection, you're in complete control. You're calm, you're centered, and you're watching them like a chess player watches an opponent who's just made a fatal mistake. The second strategy builds on the first, and it's something I learned from watching my Aunt Polly handle situations that would have broken lesser people. She called it tactical agreement, but it's more nuanced than it sounds. When someone's being aggressive, they're expecting resistance. They're braced for a fight. Their entire emotional state is geared toward conflict. So what do? You disarm them completely by agreeing with them, but not in the way they expect. You agree with the emotion, not the content. Let me give you an example. Someone comes at you saying you're incompetent, that you've ruined everything, that you never do anything right. Most people either crumble and apologize, or they fight back with their own accusations. Both responses feed the aggression. Instead, you say something like, "I can see this situation has really affected you," or "It's clear you're frustrated about how this turned out. Notice what you're doing here. You're not admitting fault." You're not agreeing with their assessment. You're simply acknowledging their emotional state, which is the only thing they're actually capable of caring about in that moment. And here's what happens. Their brain short circuits. They came ready for war, and you've just offered them understanding. Not weakness, not submission, but genuine acknowledgement of their experience. This does 2 things simultaneously. First, it takes the wind out of their sails, because you've given them what they were really seeking all along, which is to be heard. Second, it positions you as the reasonable one, the person who's capable of seeing beyond their own ego, which automatically elevates your status in the interaction. Now, the third strategy is one that most people find counterintuitive. It's the one that's saved me more times than I can count when dealing with truly dangerous individuals. I call it the redirect and refocus technique. Here's how it works. When someone's being aggressive, they're locked onto a target,
and that target is usually you, your actions, your character, or something you represent. They've built this entire narrative in their head about why you're the problem, why you're the enemy, why everything would be fine if you would just admit you're wrong or do what they want. Fighting against that narrative directly is exhausting and ultimately futile because you're trying to use logic against emotion, and emotion wins that fight every single time. Instead, you redirect their focus onto something external, something that allows them to maintain their sense of righteousness while moving away from the attack on you.
Let me give you a concrete example. From my own experience, I once had a business partner who was furious about a deal that went sideways. He was convinced I'd betrayed him, that I'd put my interests above our partnership. He came into my office, ready to destroy everything we'd built. Now I could have spent hours defending my actions, presenting evidence, trying to convince him of my innocence, but that would have kept the focus on me as the problem. Instead, I redirected. I said, "You're right to be angry about this situation. The real question is, who benefits from us turning on each other right now?" Immediately, his anger had a new direction. Instead of fighting me, we were suddenly on the same side, looking outward at potential external threats. The aggression didn't disappear, but it was no longer aimed at me. It was rechanneled towards solving the actual problem. This technique works because it preserves their ego while giving them an exit ramp from the confrontation. They get to keep their sense of being wronged, but you've shifted the battlefield entirely. The fourth strategy is something that requires genuine courage, and it's where most people fail because it feels like vulnerability, but it's actually the opposite. I call it the calm exposition of consequences. Notice I didn't say threats. Threats are what weak people use when they're desperate to appear strong. Consequences are what powerful people state as simple facts of reality. When you're dealing with aggressive behavior, especially repeated aggressive behavior, at some point you need to establish boundaries. But the way you establish those boundaries determines whether you're respected or dismissed. Aggressive people are constantly testing boundaries, pushing to see where the line is, trying to find your breaking point. If you set boundaries with emotion, with anger or fear in your voice, they know they've gotten to you, and they'll keep pushing. But if you state consequences with the same tone you'd use to discuss the weather, you communicate something entirely different. You're not reacting, you're not threatened, you're simply informing them of how reality works. I've sat across from men who could have killed me and said things like, "If you continue down this path, here's what will happen," and then laid out the consequences in such a matter-of-fact way that they understood I wasn't making threats, I was making predictions based on an understanding of how the world works. This communicates supreme confidence because you're not trying to control their behavior through intimidation, you're simply informing them of natural cause and effect. And here's the critical part: once you've stated the consequence, you have to be willing to follow through. Because if you state a boundary and then don't enforce it, you've just taught them that your words mean nothing, and every future interaction will be even worse. Strategy number 5 is perhaps the most sophisticated, and it's one I learned from observing people far more educated than I'll ever be. It's the art of the clarifying question. When someone's being aggressive, their arguments are almost always built on assumptions, generalizations, and emotional reasoning. They'll say things like, "You always," or "You never," or "Everyone knows." These are the building blocks of aggressive rhetoric because they're designed to overwhelm you with the weight of absolute certainty. Most people either accept these statements as true and start defending themselves, or they counter with their own generalizations, and you end up in a pointless back and forth that goes nowhere. Instead, you ask clarifying questions that force them to be specific. Always. Can you give me a specific example of when that happened? Everyone knows? Who specifically have you spoken to about this? These questions aren't aggressive. You're not being sarcastic or condescending. You're genuinely asking for clarification, or at least you appear to be. What you're actually doing is dismantling their argument piece by piece, forcing them to move from the emotional high ground of absolute statements to the uncomfortable terrain of specific facts. And here's what happens almost every time: they can't do it. Because their aggression wasn't based on a careful analysis of specific events, it was based on a feeling, an impression, a story they told themselves. When you force them to be specific, the foundation of their aggression crumbles. But here's the key: you have to ask these questions with genuine curiosity, not with the energy of someone trying to win a debate. The moment they sense you're being manipulative or sarcastic, you lose the advantage. You need to ask as if you truly want to understand their perspective, which, ironically, is often what causes them to realize they haven't actually thought their position through. The sixth and final strategy is one that requires the most self-discipline. And it's what separates people who occasionally handle aggressive situations well from people who command respect in every interaction they have. I call it the emotional anchor. Here's the reality: you cannot control how other people behave. You can only control how you respond. And the single most important factor in how you respond is your internal emotional state. If you're operating from fear, from anger, from a need to be validated or prove yourself, you've already lost before the interaction even begins. Aggressive people are like predators in the wild. They can sense weakness, they can smell fear, they can detect when someone's operating from a place of internal chaos. And when they sense that, they press harder. The emotional anchor is your ability to remain completely grounded, regardless of external circumstances. It's not about suppressing emotion. It's about choosing which emotions drive your behavior. Before I walk into any high-stakes situation, I spend a few moments getting absolutely clear on who I am and what I stand for. Not who I wish I was, not who I'm afraid people think I am, but who I actually am at my core. And from that place of clarity, I make decisions. When someone's screaming at me, threatening me, trying to intimidate me, I'm not thinking about the screaming. I'm anchored to my core truth. I know what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not. I know what I stand for and what I won't compromise on. And from that place, their aggression is just noise. It's weather happening around me, but it's not happening to me. This is what allows me to use all the other strategies effectively. The strategic pause works because I'm genuinely comfortable in silence. The tactical agreement works because I'm not threatened by acknowledging someone else's emotions. The redirect works because I'm focused on outcomes, not ego. The consequences work because I'm stating my truth, not making empty threats. The clarifying questions work because I'm genuinely curious about reality, not just trying to win. Everything flows from this internal anchor. Now, let me tie all of this together because I know some of you are thinking this sounds good in theory, but wondering how it actually works in the chaos of a real confrontation. Here's what you need to understand. These aren't 6 separate techniques you pull out one at a time, like tools from a box. There's 6 aspects of a single unified approach to human interaction. An approach built on the understanding that true power comes not from dominating others, but from being utterly unshakable in yourself. When you stop needing to win every argument, when you stop needing to be right, when you stop needing external validation of your worth, you become dangerous in the best possible way. You become someone who can't be manipulated through aggression, because aggression only works on people who are internally unstable. Think about why people use aggression in the first place. It's a shortcut. It's an attempt to bypass rational discussion and force compliance through intimidation. But intimidation only works if the target values avoiding conflict more than they value their own principles. When you're anchored, when you know who you are and what you stand for, intimidation becomes irrelevant. Someone can raise their voice, make threats, try every manipulation tactic in the book, and you're just observing it all with the detached interest of someone watching a stage performance. I've built an empire, not by being the loudest voice in the room, but by being the most controlled. In a world full of people desperate to prove themselves, desperate to be seen, desperate to dominate, the person who's mastered themselves has an almost supernatural advantage. These strategies I've given you aren't really about handling aggressive people at all. They're about becoming the kind of person aggressive tactics don't work on. And once you become that person, you'll notice something remarkable happens. You'll encounter less aggression overall, because aggressive people, like all predators, prefer easy targets. When they sense you're not going to give them the reaction they're seeking, when they realize their tactics are ineffective, they typically move on to someone else, or they adjust their behavior entirely. The few who persist in their aggression despite your mastery of these techniques are revealing something important about themselves. They're not actually trying to accomplish anything practical. They're simply acting out their own internal chaos. And once you recognize that, you can respond with the appropriate level of engagement, which is often minimal to none at all. So here's my challenge to you. Pick one of these strategies and commit to practicing it in your next difficult interaction. Not all 6, just one. Master the strategic pause, get comfortable with silence, or try tactical agreement and see how acknowledging someone's emotions without agreeing with their conclusions changes the entire dynamic. Or practice the emotional anchor by spending time getting clear on who you are before you engage with difficult people. Because knowledge without action is just entertainment, and I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to give you tools that actually work. Tools I've proven in situations where failure meant consequences far more severe than embarrassment or discomfort. The question is, are you willing to put in the work to master yourself? Because that's what this really comes down to. Not mastering others, mastering yourself. And once you've done that, handling aggressive people becomes almost effortless because you're no longer operating in their framework at all.